everyone, welcome. I'm here today with an empty house. Actually, my dog Murdoch and I are going to make this video on Chapter 12, the Second War for Independence and the Upsurge of Nationalism. So you might hear him rustling around in the background, and I apologize for that. But here we go. Got a couple of key points I wanted to talk about here in Chapter 12. First of all, you probably remember hearing that the War of 1812 is technically a draw, but just keep in mind that the United States was fighting for a lot more than territory, or even for principle. It's now establishing itself on the global scene and securing for itself a sense of legitimacy in the eyes of potential friends and enemies. On top of that, John Marshall, as the Federalist legacy, is going to greatly increase the power of the federal government throughout several court cases discussed in the chapter. He rules on issues such as the Bank of the U.S., he talks about superseding state laws, and the sanctity of contracts. In a way, he also places a federal stamp on interstate trade. Finally, sectionalism can be seen with such issues as the extension of slavery into the territories. The Missouri Compromise is a prime example of the government's attempt to deal with this. On to Canada, that was the slogan of the day. The pageant tells us that military leadership in the states, however, was quite weak at this time, and many officers, in fact, were past their prime. They felt that Canada was a great place to attack the British because they were weak there, and the British and the Canadian forces were able to defeat the Americans from their military skill as well as from general mud and general confusion. The American Navy, however, did have some success, including the victory of the USS Constitution over the HMS Guerriere, as well as Oliver Hazard Perry's victory on Lake Erie, which protected New England from New York, and in fact, the British troops had to retreat, after which they were overtaken by Harrison's army and beaten at the Battle of the Thames in October of 1813. One last victory, and a dramatic one at that, occurred on September 11th near Plattsburgh in 1814. This cleared the British of Lake Champlain and further protected New York and New England. In the East, there were other issues with the British. The British had burned most of D.C. However, American forces in Baltimore hung on tight. During this time, Francis Scott Key penned the lyrics for the national anthem. The most celebrated battle of the War of 1812 actually occurred after the war was over, but from it emerges a national hero in Andrew Jackson. And this victory helps to propel him into the presidency, and despite whatever criticism there was of him, or that we may have of him, we all can agree that he had a huge influence on the course of the nation and on the office of the presidency. We can probably look at the Treaty of Ghent as more of an armistice than anything else, because really nothing changes hands after the war in terms of territory. There's no mention of the American grievances that started the war, and in a sense it is a draw. But what does change after this is that the United States has this sort of legitimate claim to being a nation after the war is over. There's also an increased sense of nationalism that goes along with that. Henry Clay was involved in negotiating the Treaty of Ghent. Here's a picture of him. And as described in the pageant, he was a high-living and card-playing fellow who was despised by the puritanical John Quincy Adams. Oh, those Adamses. The Federalists, and to some extent New England, actually come off looking un-American and borderline treasonous after the delegates of the Hartford Convention present their request to Congress. While some of their concerns are logical, like the request for compensation due to the losses associated with the embargo, others, such as their talk of secession, are downright radical. Unfortunately for them, they didn't actually get to Congress before the end of the war, so at that point nationalism is very high, and therefore they really just seem to be in the wrong for complaining about anything. And so this is really the death blow to the Federalist Party, but remember that New England was associated with federalism, and obviously they're associated with it more after this. With the U.S. and the British back on decent terms, especially after the Rush-Bagot Agreement in 1817, which severely limited naval armaments on the Great Lakes, the door for westward expansion is now being swung open. I like how the American Pageant goes into this section here on nationalism, because as they tell us, it's not just displaying flags outside and writing and singing national anthems. A real, true American character is emerging in the early part of the 1800s. The American voice, for example, can be heard in magazines and in textbooks. A new center for American financial system is created in the Second Bank of the U.S., and our national capital, which had pretty humble beginnings, will begin to develop its own feel and identity. anyone who has actually been to D.C. or has seen pictures of it would probably agree that today it hardly represents the infant city described by Joseph Ellis and his founding brothers. Okay, back to Henry Clay and his American system. It's a sort of comprehensive plan for improving the United States. It involves the first ever protective tariff in U.S. history. That is to say that it was designed to be protective as opposed to, say, Hamilton's tariff, which was designed to raise revenue. So the tariff of 1816 will facilitate the development of U.S. industry. In addition to that, Henry Clay's American system argues in favor of a strong centralized bank, which we will have in the second bank of the United States, as well as internal improvements, infrastructure. And I, by the way, really like developing infrastructure. In my personal opinion, it's hard to argue against that. Renovating, innovating, fostering efficiency, and creating jobs for people to build all that, that's all good stuff in my eyes. The American System memory aid, as provided by Adam Norris, is BIT. Remember BIT. B for Bank of the U.S., I for Internal Improvements, and T for Tariff. And on to the era of good feelings, a phrase that is used to describe James Madison's presidency, probably because there's only one real political party to speak of. But however, there are actually several things that occur that are not really indicative of good feelings. And so the debates on the Bank of the U.S., the tariff on the sale of public lands, and now on the extension of slavery are all hotly contested. In fact, it's a time where nationalism that really emerged after the War of 1812 starts to be replaced with sectionalism, all of which can be seen in the debates over the above mentioned. Another reason not to call the Madison presidency an era of good feelings would be the financial panic of 1819. In this case, it was frontier lands that were being overspeculated and leading on to this financial panic, but in many cases, overspeculation is a major cause of other financial panics as well. So think stock speculation throughout the 1920s, leading to the Great Depression, and perhaps the housing market in the early 2000s that led to the Great Recession that began in 2007. One thing about the USA is that it just has a knack for expansion and growth, right? We already have mentioned that the framers had foresight for this and that they knew or they really believed this was going to happen, and policies such as the Northwest Ordinance show that great care was taken to facilitate this growth. In the early 19th century, several things encouraged people to move west, including abundant, cheap land. Also keep in mind that soil in the east was, if they're growing tobacco, for example, would be depleted, and that the American population was constantly growing and was supplemented by immigration. So now with peace with Britain, France out of the way, and a less hostile native population, westward expansion begins again. The question of extending slavery in the territories is an important question and was a dividing question for sure. And so the House of Reps had actually in 1819 tried to make a statement, I suppose, in passing the Talmadge Amendment, which stated that no more slaves could be brought into Missouri. As the pageant says, a roar of anger burst from the slaveholding South. So Henry Clay in 1820 proposed the Missouri Compromise, and this would admit Missouri and Maine at the same time, thus maintaining the balance of slave states and free states. Furthermore, it draws a line on the map at 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude, which will become the line of demarcation between slave states and free states in the West. The majority of that territory is located above the 36-30 line, and therefore the majority of that territory will be closed to slavery. This will obviously be later changed in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, yet sectional differences are very clear in this. Here's a map of that compromise so you can see just how much territory will be closed to slavery. So we're going to look at these court cases that are covered in Chapter 12 in class, but there's a few things I want to say. Obviously, as you've heard from just about everybody who talks about APUSH, John Marshall increased the power of the federal government, and so you should really know that. Make sure you know that. And also understand that the Supreme Court is now, really an equal member within the government. That's something that I think I said in my Chapter 11 video as well. But there are several court cases, specific cases, that will be discussed, including McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819, where Maryland had tried to tax a branch of the Bank of the U.S., and Marshall did not allow that. I believe he said that the power to tax is the power to destroy. Cohens v. Virginia in 1821, the Supreme Court is going to say that it can now review decisions of state courts. So again, demonstrating increased power by the federal government. Also to be discussed in class will be the case of Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824, which deals with interstate trade. It's an important decision as the federal government will continue to use interstate trade as a means to regulate the economy. The Interstate Commerce Act, for example, in 1887 allows the government to set railroad rates. It said that railroad rates had to be reasonable and just to prevent those companies from taking advantage of farmers. Also, Fletcher versus Peck deals with contracts and their supremacy, a point that can also be seen with the next court case of Dartmouth College versus Woodward. Just remember that if you see John Marshall on the test, he was a Federalist and he expanded the power of the federal government. In this case, he says that a charter was a contract and the Constitution protected contracts against state infringements. So in this section, we can see that a part of Florida and a part of Texas are traded in 1819 with the Adams-Onis Treaty. And this consolidated land holdings for the Spanish to the south central U.S. and Latin America. Spain at the time was preoccupied with several revolutions that were occurring, including one in Chile, Venezuela, and Argentina. And Andrew Jackson had invaded Florida also, which is always a good reason to get out of there. On this map, you can see that treaty line, and you can also see the treaty with Britain in 1818, which set the border between Canada and the United States. The other day in class, we discussed how Jackson was later criticized and labeled as King Jackson, and then I made a joke about the one and only King Jackson, which failed miserably. Well, the pageant wasn't referring to either of these. They were talking about the concerns in the U.S. that European despots would start to deliberately provoke these new Latin American republics. And so in the post-Napoleon world, monarchs were returning to Europe. In Italy, you can see in 1821, and Spain, 1823. Also issued in 1823 is the Monroe Doctrine. And so this is a statement to Europe which says that the Western Hemisphere will be within the American sphere of influence. And it says that Europe should not colonize and should not intervene in Latin America. And in return for that, the U.S. will stay out of European affairs. Now, this shows a lot of nationalism, and it shows the growth that the United States experienced in the first quarter of the 19th century. But as the pageant says, it's only as big as the American military and no bigger. It's not necessarily enforceable. However, it'll be cited later on in the 19th century and early 20th century by expansionists as justification for American intervention. Okay, thanks for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email.